Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are walking into a story that, for most of us, feels like it's just burned into the collective memory. It's one of those events where if I just say the word Waco, you immediately see the images.
Oh, it's instantaneous. You see the fire, you see the tanks, punching holes in the walls.
Lots of smoke.
You see the FBI agents in those blue windbreakers standing out there in the Texas dust. It is the defining image of a government standoff gone horribly, tragically wrong.
Exactly. It's sort of frozen in time as this 51-day news cycle from 1993. But the mission for today's deep dive is to completely dismantle that simplified view. We are going to peel back the layers of history that go back decades before the first shot was fired.
Right.
Because when you look at the source material, the court documents, the theological manuscripts, the histories of the sect, you realize that the Branch Davidians weren't just a cult that popped up in the desert overnight.
Far from it. That is, I think, the biggest misconception. David Koresh didn't invent this movement. He didn't build the theology from scratch. He was actually a latecomer to a very complex, very old religious lineage.
It's a whole family tree.
It is. We're talking about a group with a history of prophets, massive power struggles, and theological schisms that make, Game of Thrones look like a children's book.
And the details we found in these records they are genuinely baffling. We're going to talk about theological debates that were settled by digging up corpses.
Yeah, that actually happened.
And we're going to talk about eating ice cream with prosecutors after a shootout.
Is stranger than fiction. But to understand the ending, to understand why those people stayed in that building while it burned, you have to understand the beginning. You have to understand the internal logic that was built up over 60 years.
So let's unpack this. We have to rewind the clock all the way back to 1929. We aren't even in Texas yet. We're in Southern California, and we need to meet a man named Victor Houda.
Victor Houda. He is the patriarch of this entire story. He was a Bulgarian immigrant who came to the United States and eventually converted to the Seventh-Day Adventist Church. By the late 1920s, he was a Sabbath school teacher in Los Angeles.
Okay, before we go further, we really need to clarify what the Seventh-day Adventist Church, the SDA Church, actually is, because it is the soil from which the Branch Davidians grew.
Absolutely. This is crucial context.
Right. This isn't some fringe group in itself. This is a mainstream Christian denomination.
Correct. They are a major global denomination. But they have two very specific characteristics that are vital here. First, as the name implies, they observe the Sabbath on Saturday, not Sunday. That's a big distinction.
A Saturday Sabbath church.
And second, they have a very, very intense focus on the Advent, or the second coming of Christ. The entire church was basically born out of the belief that we are living in the end times. There's an urgency to it.
So Houda is a teacher in this environment. He's teaching Sabbath school, but he starts thinking the church has lost its edge, doesn't he?
Precisely. He felt they were getting too comfortable, too worldly. They were building hospitals, schools, becoming institutionalized. He thought they were losing that urgency about the end of the world.
The fire was gone.
The fire was gone. So in 1929, Outaf claims to have received a new message, a specialized message, just for the Adventist Church. He publishes these views in a book titled The Shepherd's Rod, The 144,000 Miles, a Call for Reformation.
The Shepherd's Rod. That sounds authoritative. It sounds it's discipline.
It was meant to be. The title references the book of Micah in the Bible. Houda was essentially positioning himself as the rod of correction for the church.
He is the one who's going to whip them back into shape.
Exactly. He was calling for a purification of the church. He believed that before Christ could return, the church itself had to be cleansed of the tares, the unfaithful members. He believed he was identifying the 144,000 chosen people mentioned in the book of Revelation who would stand at the end of time.
I can't imagine the church leadership was thrilled about a local school teacher telling them they were doing it all wrong.
They were not thrilled at all. The Adventist leadership reviewed his work, and, they flatly rejected it. They said it was contrary to basic church teachings. They viewed it as divisive, heretical even.
So what did they do?
They did what churches do when someone won't get in line. Local congregations disfellowshipped Houda and anyone who followed him. They were kicked out.
So they're out on their own. This is the first schism. And usually when a guy gets kicked out of a church, the group just kind of dissolves. But Houda was determined.
He was a true believer in his own message. In 1934, he took his followers and moved west to the wilderness, specifically an area west of Waco, Texas.
Okay, so there is the Waco connection, established way back in the 30s. This wasn't just David Koresh throwing a dart at a map in the 90s.
No, not at all. This land has a lineage. Houda established a headquarters there. And eventually, in 1942, he officially names the group the General Association of Davidian Seventh-Day Adventists.
Let's pause on that name, Davidian. That's not a coincidence, right? What's the significance?
No, it's central to their whole belief system. It indicates a central belief in the restoration of the Davidic kingdom of Israel. He would have taught that part of the end times wasn't just about being raptured up to heaven.
It was about something on earth.
It was about the restoration of a literal kingdom on earth, with its capital in Jerusalem. They believed they were the vanguard for that kingdom. And the location they established, they called it the Mount Carmel Center.
Mount Carmel, that sounds biblical.
It is, very much so. In the Bible, Mount Carmel is where the prophet Elijah confronted the false prophets of Baal and defeated them in a fiery showdown.
It's a place of showdown.
It's a place where true authority confronts false authority. That's the vibe Howard F. was setting from the very beginning.
Now, this is a crucial dynamic to understand. Even though they were kicked out of the main Seventh-day Adventist church, they didn't just ignore it. They didn't go start a completely new religion like Scientology or Mormonism.
Right. They viewed themselves as the real Adventists. Think of it like a government in exile. They believed they were the only rightful continuation of the Adventist message. They believed Victor Houteff was the divinely selected prophet, the true successor to Ellen G. White, who was a founder of the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
So their mission wasn't to convert Methodists or Baptists. Their mission was to convert other Adventists.
Exactly. The Davidians, and later the Branch Davidians, actively hunted, and that's the term often used in the literature, members of the current Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Hunted them.
They would go to Adventist gatherings, camp meetings, hand out pamphlets, and try to convince people that the main church was Laodicean. That's the biblical term for lukewarm. And that the real truth was with Houteff at Mount Carmel.
That must have been incredibly annoying for the main church leadership.
Annoying is putting it mildly. The main church had to issue regular warnings to their members about this shepherd's rod offshoot. They were terrified of these people poaching their flock.
And this must have created a really deep us versus them mentality in the Davidian group.
Oh, absolutely. They felt persecuted. They felt they were the small remnant holding the truth against a massive, corrupt hierarchy. That psychology is so important. If you spend 60 years believing you are the persecuted few holding the truth, you develop a very, very thick skin against outside pressure.
Yeah, pressure from the government, from law enforcement.
From anyone. It's all just Babylon trying to crush the truth.
So Houteff builds this community, Mount Carmel. It's strict, it's focused on the end times, but it's relatively stable. But then, in 1955, Victor Houteff dies. And this seems to be a recurring theme in this story. When the prophet dies, things get chaotic.
Power vacuums are dangerous in prophetic movements. When Victor died, there was no clear successor named. His wife, Florence Houteff. She basically usurped the leadership. She claimed to be a prophet as well.
And she didn't just maintain the status quo. She decided to swing for the fences with a big, bold prophecy.
She did. And this is a classic mistake in apocalyptic groups. She was convinced that the apocalypse was not just imminent, but that she knew the date.
Oh, no. You never put a date on it.
You never put a date on it. Specifically, she predicted the fulfillment of Ezekiel 9-8, a biblical prophecy of judgment and slaughter in Jerusalem. And she put a date on it, April 22, 1959.
Now, wait. Was this date in her husband's writings? Did Victor Houteff predict this?
No, it wasn't. This was Florence's addition. She was interpreting the timeline herself. But the faithful listened. This was the next step. Hundreds of followers gathered at the Mount Carmel Center near Waco. People sold their homes, their businesses, liquidated their assets, and moved to Texas, waiting for the end of the world.
April 20th, 1959.
They waited. And as you might guess, the anticipated events did not occur. The sun rose, the sun set, no slaughter, no kingdom, no apocalypse.
The great disappointment?
It was devastating for the group. It shattered their credibility. You have to imagine the psychological toll. You've given it up everything. You're standing in a field in Texas, and just nothing happens.
The silence must have been deafening.
Following this failure, the group began to disintegrate. Florence eventually dissolved the Davidian Association in 1962. She admitted error. She sold off most of the property. They had actually purchased a new, larger property they called New Mount Carmel, and the group scattered.
It seems like that should have been the end of the story. Failed prophecy, group dissolves, everyone goes home. How on earth does this survive?
Because belief is resilient. And where there is a disillusioned flock, there is always someone waiting in the wings with a new message to explain why it failed. Or to say, no, look over here, I have the real truth.
Enter Benjamin Roden.
Enter Benjamin Roden. That's a name that becomes very, very important.
So who was he?
Benjamin Roden was a follower of Howtef. But back in 1955, when Victor died, Roden had already proclaimed he had a new message from God. He had tried to claim leadership then, but Florence blocked him.
So he was waiting for his chance.
He was. When Florence's prophecy failed so spectacularly in 1959, Roden stepped in and essentially said, I told you so. You were following the wrong guide. God's message didn't fail. Her message failed.
He picked up the pieces.
He did. He formed a group he called the Branch Davidians.
Okay, so here's the name change. This is where the branch comes in. Why branch?
It's an allusion to the anointed branch mentioned in the book of Zechariah, chapters 3 and 6. It's a messianic title. He was signaling that this was the next stage of the revelation. First came the shepherd's rod, which was Hotef. Now comes the branch, which is him, Roden.
And a new chapter.
A new chapter. And he succeeded in taking control of the remnants of the group.
And he wanted the land back, right? Because Florence had sold it.
He was obsessed with the land. Florence had sold most of the new Mount Carmel property, but Roden managed to take possession of the remaining 77 acres in 1962. By 1973, he bought that property outright. And this is the specific plot of land that would simply become known as Mount Carmel.
The place we all see in the news footage.
That's the one.
So Benjamin Roden stabilizes the group. He runs it for a while. He establishes the Branch Davidian identity. But then he dies in 1978. And again, who takes over?
His wife, Lois Roden. She becomes the next Davidian prophet at the compound.
A second female prophet.
Yes. And Lois was actually quite fascinating theologically. She began teaching that the Holy Spirit was feminine. She published a magazine called Shekinah. She was trying to evolve the group's theology to bring in this feminine divine aspect.
That's a pretty progressive idea for that kind of group.
It was. But her leadership would face a challenge from a young man who arrived at Mount Carmel in 1981, a man named Vernon Howell.
Vernon Howell, who we, of course, know better as David Koresh. But he wasn't Koresh yet.
Not yet. In 1981, he was just Vernon Howell. He was a young man, a high school dropout, a musician, a handyman. He had been kicked out of his local Adventist church for being a nuisance and trying to marry the pastor's daughter.
Oh.
He comes to Mount Carmel to study biblical prophecy under Lois Roden.
And here is where the story shifts from, theological history to something that feels like a very messy drama.
It was a complicated dynamic. Howell was in his early 20s. Lois Roden was in her late 60s. And yet, Howell engaged in an affair with her.
That is a significant age gap. And surely this wasn't just a romance. It was a power play, right?
It was absolutely a power play. But Howell wrapped it in theological justification. He claimed God told him to do it. He told the group that he needed to father a child with the prophetess.
A child with a woman in her late 60s.
Yes. According to his understanding, this child would be the chosen one who would play a vital role in the end times. He was positioning himself not just as a student, but as a consort to the prophetess, someone essential to the divine plan.
It's amazing how often personal desires get wrapped up in God's will in these narratives. But Lois wasn't the only Roden he had to deal with. She had a son, George Roden.
Right. George Roden felt he was the rightful heir. He was Ben and Lois's son. He viewed himself as the next prophet by bloodline. So you have the biological son versus the young, charismatic lover. It was a recipe for disaster.
And George Roden sounds like he was intense.
George was extremely volatile. He reportedly wore a Star of David on his chest and carried an Uzi. He was not a guy you wanted to cross. When Lois died, the rivalry just exploded.
Yeah.
George claimed the presidency. But Vernon Howell had gained the loyalty of the majority of the Davidians because he was simply a better preacher.
He had the charisma.
He had the charisma George lacked. He could hold people spellbound for hours dissecting scripture. George was just angry.
So we have a schism within the schism.
Exactly. By 1984, the group split. Howell and his followers were actually forced out of Mount Carmel. George Roden accused Howell of starting a fire that destroyed a $500,000 administration building and press on the property.
So Howell leaves.
He takes his followers to Palestine, Texas. They live in rough conditions, in buses and makeshift shelters, essentially in exile. Meanwhile, George stays at Mount Carmel and renames the compound Rodenville.
Rodenville, that really asserts ownership.
It does. But George is becoming more and more erratic.
Ah.
And this leads to perhaps the most bizarre incident in the entire 60-year history of the sect.
The corpse challenge.
The corpse challenge.
I read this 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Walk us through this.
It was an attempt by George Roden to prove his spiritual supremacy. He was tired of Vernon Howell claiming to be the true leader. So George issued a challenge, a duel. He said, if you are the true prophet, you should be able to raise the dead.
And he don't mean that metaphorically.
Yeah, no. George Roden went to the community cemetery and exhumed a corpse. It was the body of a woman named Anna Hughes, a Davidian who had been dead for 2 decades.
He dug up a skeleton.
He placed the remains in the chapel and challenged Vernon Howell to come and resurrect her. He said, whoever can bring her back to life is the true leader.
That is, I mean, it's horrifying, but it's also just absurd.
It is. Howell obviously refused to participate in the resurrection contest. But he was smart. He saw legal opportunity. Digging up a body is a felony. It's abuse of a corpse. So Howell went to the local authorities. He went to the sheriff and said, George Roden has dug up a body. You need to arrest him.
And what did the sheriff say?
The authorities told him they needed evidence. They couldn't just raid the compound on his word. They told him to bring proofs. A photograph.
And this is where we get the dress rehearsal for 1993, right? Because Howell decides to get that proof himself.
In a way, yes. On November 3rd, 1987, Vernon Howell and 7 of his followers prepared to go to Mount Carmel. But they didn't just take a camera.
No.
They dressed in camouflage. They blackened their faces. And they armed themselves with 5.223 caliber semi-automatic rifles, 2.22 caliber rifles, 2 12-gauge shotguns, and nearly 400 rounds of ammunition.
That is a lot of firepower for a photography expedition.
It was an apparent attempt to retake the compound by force, using the photo as a pretext. They crept onto the property. A gunfight ensued between Howell's group and George Roden.
Actual shooting.
Yes. For nearly an hour, bullets were flying. George Roden was shot in the chest, but he survived.
And you'd think, okay, you raided a compound with semi-automatic rifles, you shot a guy, you're going to jail for a very long time.
You would think. They were arrested. They went to trial for attempted murder. But here's the twist. Howell's defense team argued that they were only there to get evidence of a crime, the corpse, and that George Roden, the madman with the Uzi, had fired first. They argued self-defense.
And the jury bought it.
They did. The jury found Howell's 7 followers not guilty. And as for Howell himself, the jury couldn't agree on a verdict. It was a mistrial.
That is unbelievable. He walks.
It emboldened them. It validated Howell's belief that he was anointed, that God was protecting him from the legal system of Babylon. And this is a detail I love. After the acquittal, Vernon Howell actually invited the prosecutors to Mount Carmel for ice cream.
No way.
Yes, they sat down and had ice cream. It shows the level of confidence or perhaps arrogance that was building. He felt untouchable.
So what happens to George Roden?
Eventually, George Roden was sent to a mental hospital for separate murder. He killed a man completely unrelated to this saga with an axe, which allowed Howell to finally take complete, undisputed control of Mount Carmel.
So by the late 80s, Vernon Howell is the king of the hill. He has the land. He has the people. And this is when the transformation really solidifies. He changes his name.
Yes. In 1990, he legally sheds the name Vernon Howell and becomes David Koresh.
Let's break down that name. It's not random. It's a manifesto.
It is absolutely a manifesto.
Mm-hmm.
David refers to the biblical King David. This implies a royal lineage. He is saying he's the spiritual heir to the throne of Israel.
And Koresh?
Koresh is the Hebrew form of Cyrus. Cyrus the Great was the Persian king who conquered Babylon and allowed the Jews to return to Israel. He's a messianic figure, but a Gentile one.
So he's casting himself as a messianic figure, but a specific type. Cyrus wasn't a priest. He was a conqueror, a king.
Correct. He wanted to establish a new lineage of world leaders. He saw himself as a spiritual king. And this theological framework brings us to the Lamb doctrine. This is core Koresh theology.
Okay.
Koresh interpreted Revelation chapter 5, which speaks of a lamb who is worthy to open the 7 seals of a scroll.
And traditionally, Christians believe the lamb is Jesus.
Correct. But Koresh taught a distinction. He suggested that this lamb, the one who opens the seals, is a sinful Messiah who comes before Jesus to pave the way for the second coming.
The sinful Messiah.
Yes, a flawed human figure. And he identified himself as that lamb. He taught that Christ had waited 2,000 years to open the seals, and now he, Koresh, was the only one who could unlock them.
That is a massive claim. It essentially says you cannot understand the Bible or get to God without me.
It is. It's the ultimate spiritual gatekeeping. And it changed the identity of the group. By 1993, Koresh was encouraging his followers to stop calling themselves Branch Davidians. That was the old way. He wanted them to be students of the 7 seals.
And during the siege itself?
During the siege, one follower even announced they wanted to be known as Koreshians.
Koreshians. It really centers the entire faith on him personally.
It does. And this new lineage concept, the idea that he was establishing a new spiritual royalty, served as the basis for the allegations that later brought the ATF to their door.
We have to touch on those allegations. This is where the theology meets criminal behavior.
Yes. The belief system justified polygamy for Koresh. He taught that as the Lamb, he was entitled to and required to build the house of David. He was accused of fathering children with members' wives. He dissolved the marriages of his male followers and claimed the women as his spiritual wives.
And the men accepted this? They just gave up their wives?
Many did. It speaks to the power of the theology. If you believe this man holds the keys to the seven seals and the seven seals determine your eternal fate, you submit, you sacrifice, even your marriage.
And there were allegations regarding underage girls as well.
Yes. The allegations were that some of these wives were as young as 12 or 13. This was the house of David he was building. And this wasn't just internal gossip, it became a legal matter. The state of Texas was investigating these claims of child abuse.
But before we get to the law enforcement side, I want to talk about their flag. Symbols matter, and the flag they flew tells us a lot about their mindset.
I'm glad you brought that up. Visuals are so important here. The original Davidian flag from 1942 had a red lion and a black six-pointed star. But under Koresh, things evolved.
It changed.
During the siege, they flew a flag that Steve Schneider, Koresh's right-hand man, described in negotiations. It contained a stylistic Star of David and a fiery flying serpent.
A fiery flying serpent? What is that?
It's a reference to Isaiah chapter 14. But more importantly, Koresh claimed this flag signified that Mount Carmel was a sovereign power.
Sovereign power. That phrase sends chills down my spine because it implies they didn't see themselves as citizens of the U.S. anymore. They weren't Texans. They were their own nation.
Exactly. They viewed the Mount Carmel Center not as a property in the United States, but as the embassy of the kingdom of God. And when you believe you are a sovereign nation with a divine mandate and federal agents show up at your door,
you don't see it as a police raid.
You see it as an act of war. You see it as Babylon attacking Jerusalem.
Which brings us to February 28, 1993. The spark.
The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the ATF, had obtained a search warrant. They were aware of the sexual abuse allegations, but their primary jurisdiction was illegal weapons violations. And they had significant evidence.
And they had good reason to suspect weapons, right? It all started with a UPS driver.
The mag bag incident. It's a classic example of how small things lead to big events. A UPS driver had been delivering packages to the compound for a while. The invoices were suspicious: firearm parts, chemicals, black powder. But in May 1992, a package broke open in the back of the truck.
Whoops.
The driver looked inside. He saw grenades.
Grenades. Not like firearm parts. Actual grenades.
50 pineapple-style grenade holes. Now, owning the holes isn't necessarily illegal if they aren't live, but combined with the black powder and the chemical orders, it painted a pretty clear picture of manufacturing explosive devices.
That is a definite red flag for the ATF.
So the ATF plans a raid. They call it Operation Trojan Horse. They decide to execute the warrant on Sunday morning, February 28th at 4:20 a.m.
4:20 in the morning. They're expecting the element of surprise. Catch them sleeping.
But they didn't get it. A local reporter had been tipped off about the raid and asked a mail carrier for directions. That mail carrier happened to be David Koresh's brother-in-law.
Oh, you cannot make this stuff up.
He went straight to the compound. Koresh knew they were coming. He told his followers, "The kingdom is here." He was prepared.
So the ATF rolls up, and they came in cattle trailers, is that right?
Yes. They were hidden in covered cattle trailers pulled by pickup trucks. They pulled up to the front of the compound. The agents poured out, and almost immediately, gunfire erupted.
And we can debate who fired the first shot forever, but the result was a war zone.
It was a firefight that lasted for approximately 2 hours. The agents were pinned down. They had lost the element of surprise. They were taking fire from multiple points in the building, from windows, from the roof.
The toll of that initial morning was horrific.
It was. 4 ATF agents were killed. Steve Willis, Robert Williams, Todd McKeon, and Conway Charles LeBlue. 16 other agents were wounded.
And inside the compound?
Inside the compound, 5 Branch Davidians were killed in the initial raid. And another, Michael Schroeder, was shot dead later that day by agents as he tried to re-enter the compound through the perimeter.
There's a bizarre detail about the flag from that morning, too. Even in the chaos, they were thinking about symbols.
Yes. Amidst the shooting, Koresh decided they needed to raise their flag. But in the confusion, they grabbed the wrong flag. It was a satin flag with a pink 6-pointed star on a gold field.
Pink and gold.
It had been a gift to Benjamin Roden years prior. Roden had never flown it because he said the colors were wrong. They weren't biblically accurate. But Koresh hung it up that morning, and that pink flag hung there in tatters, wind-blown and bullet-riddled throughout the entire 51-day siege.
That is such a strange priority in the middle of a gunfight. Put up the flag, even if it's the pink one.
It speaks to the symbolic nature of the conflict for them. This wasn't just a shootout, it was a prophetic event. They were signaling to the world and to God who they were.
So the shooting stops. A ceasefire is negotiated. But the siege begins. The FBI takes command from the ATF because federal agents have been killed.
Right. And thus began the 51-day standoff. The FBI Hostage Rescue Team, or HRT, set up a perimeter. Tanks, Bradley fighting vehicles began patrolling the grounds.
And this was a psychological war as much as a physical one.
Absolutely. The FBI used psyops tactics. They blasted loud music, recordings of rabbits being slaughtered, Tibetan chants, Nancy Sinatra day and night to deprive the Davidians of sleep. They cut the electricity.
Meanwhile, negotiators are on the phone with Koresh.
For hours and hours, Koresh would preach to them. He would give them Bible studies. Early on, they managed to facilitate the release of 19 children, but the parents stayed, and Koresh stayed. He claimed he was waiting for a message from God telling him when to surrender.
Fast forward to April 19, 1993, the final assault. The FBI decides time is up.
The patience had run out in Washington. Janet Reno, the Attorney General, approved the plan. They moved for a final siege using heavy weaponry. We're talking .50 caliber rifles and armored combat engineering vehicles, CEVs, essentially tanks with battering rams and boon arms.
The plan was to use tear gas, right? Flush them out without shooting.
Yes. The idea was to introduce non-lethal gas to make the compound uninhabitable. They started systematically punching holes in the walls of the compound and injecting CS gas. They pumped in massive amounts of gas. The official rules of engagement were that agents could only return fire, not actively assault with gunfire.
But the Davidians had gas masks
Right.
and a concrete bunker.
Right. They didn't come out. The FBI escalated, punching more holes, destroying parts of the building to open escape routes, or to let the gas penetrate further. The building was starting to fall apart.
And then around noon, the fire.
Smoke was spotted. And within minutes, 3 fires broke out almost simultaneously in different parts of the compound. And this is where the narrative splits and has remained split for decades.
Right. We need to be clear on the varying accounts here, because this is the source of so much controversy.
The government maintains, and has always maintained, supported by independent arson investigations, that the fires were deliberately started by the Branch Davidians.
Mass suicide.
Exactly. They cite listening device recordings where voices inside seem to say, "Start the fire, pour the fuel, and light it." They argue it was a mass suicide pact, a final cleansing by fire.
And the survivor view, what do they say?
Some Branch Davidian survivors maintain that the fires were started accidentally, perhaps by lanterns being knocked over as the tanks smashed through the walls, shaking the building. Others believe it was started by the assault itself, possibly from pyrotechnic tear gas rounds.
The FBI denied using pyrotechnic rounds, correct?
Initially, yes. Years later, it was revealed that some pyrotechnic rounds were used earlier in the day on a concrete bunker away from the main building. But the FBI maintains they did not use them on the wooden structure that burned.
Whatever the cause, whether it was a lantern, a tear gas canister, or a match lit by a believer, the result was a tragedy of immense scale.
Absolute devastation. The compound was a fire trap. Old wood, hay bales used for insulation, ammunition stockpiles cooking off. The Texas wind was whipping. It burned to the ground in under an hour. 76 members of the group died on April 19th,
76.
including more than 20 children. Some died from falling rubble as the tanks breached the walls, some from the suffocating effects of the fire and smoke, and some by gunshot wounds.
Gunshot wounds.
Yes. Autopsies revealed that several Davidians, including children, died of gunshot wounds fired at close range, what appears to be mercy killings or suicide pacts as the fire consumed the building. Steve Schneider, the right-hand man, was found with a gunshot wound to the mouth. Koresh was found with a gunshot wound to the forehead.
When you add the deaths from the initial raid in February,
The total death count is 82 Branch Davidians and 4 ATF agents.
it's just staggering. It's hard to process that many lives lost in an event that was broadcast live on television.
It was a national trauma, and it's still being debated today.
So the smoke clears, the compound is gone, then comes the legal battle. What happened to the survivors? Because there were people who made it out of the fire.
There were 9 survivors on the 19th, and there were those who had left earlier. There was a massive criminal prosecution. A federal grand jury indicted 12 of the survivors. The charges included aiding and abetting the murder of federal officers and weapons possession.
Did they get convicted?
It was mixed, and this is fascinating. The jury actually acquitted 4 of them of all charges. 8 were convicted on firearms charges. 5 were convicted of voluntary manslaughter. But the jury rejected the murder charges.
That's surprising given the scale of the event. It suggests the jury felt the government shared some blame, or at least that the evidence of who shot who was murky.
It shows how messy the evidence was. It wasn't a clean-cut case for them. And here's a fact that might surprise people. As of July 2007, all of the Branch Davidians who were imprisoned had been released.
They're all out.
Yes, they served their time. And there were civil suits, too. Survivors and families sued the U.S. government, Janet Reno, the governor of Texas. But those were mostly dismissed or resulted in take-nothing rulings. The courts generally found that the Davidians' own actions, not surrendering, starting fires, shooting back, were the primary cause of the tragedy.
So in the eyes of the law, the book is largely closed. But what about the group itself? Did the Branch Davidians die with David Koresh?
That's the common assumption, but it's incorrect. The group didn't disappear, it splintered. And this goes back to that identity theft concept we touched on earlier.
Right, the people who didn't follow Koresh.
Exactly. Remember, Koresh took over the group. But there were Branch Davidians who remained loyal to Lois Roden's lineage and never accepted Koresh. They view Koresh's group essentially as identity thieves who stole their name and property.
So there's a group out there today calling themselves Branch Davidians who want nothing to do with Waco 1993.
Correct. That group was led by successors of Lois Roden, Doug Mitchell, and later Trent Wild. They call themselves the Branch Davidians, and if you ask them about the fire, they say, that was Koresh's tragedy, not ours. He hijacked our name.
But are there people who still believe in Koresh? Who still follow his teachings?
Oh, yes. There was a group led by Clive Doyle, one of the survivors who escaped the fire. He lived in Waco until his death in 2022. He continued to believe Koresh was a prophet. He actually awaited his resurrection.
Wow.
He believed the fire was just a necessary stage in the prophecy, a baptism by fire before the return. For them, the story wasn't over.
Waiting for him to come back, that is true commitment to the narrative.
And then there was a third group led by a man named Charles Pace. His group is called the Branch, the Lord Our Righteousness.
That's a mouthful. What's his take on Koresh?
It's nuanced. Pace lives on the property today. He believes Koresh was appointed by God initially, but that he twisted the Bible regarding the children and wives. Pace claims Koresh became corrupted by his own power.
It's a sort of a fallen prophet.
Exactly. Pace frames himself not as a prophet, but as a teacher of righteousness.
Mm-hmm.
He has a small denomination that is legally recognized.
And what about the site, Mount Carmel? What's there now?
A new church stands there today. There are memorials to those who died. People still live there. Groups are still studying the scrolls, waiting for the end times. The history didn't stop burning just because the cameras left.
It's incredible. You know, we started this deep dive wanting to go beyond the headlines. And I think what stands out to me is just how inevitable some of this feels when you look at the history. It wasn't just a sudden explosion. It was a slow burn of schisms, radicalization, and isolation for 60 years.
That's the key takeaway for me. We have to understand the internal logic of the group. To us, looking from the outside, it was a standoff with police over guns and warrants. But to them, looking from the inside, it was the fulfillment of specific prophecies they had been studying since the 1930s.
The script was already written.
The script was written long before the tanks showed up. They weren't fighting the FBI. They were fighting the forces of Babylon in the Valley of Decision. They were living in a different reality.
Completely. And you cannot de-escalate a situation when one side is operating on a divine timeline and the other is operating on a tactical timeline. They're not even in the same conversation.
They're speaking different languages.
Before we go, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. You mentioned the flag earlier, the one with the serpent.
Sovereign power flag.
Right. They flew a flag claiming they were a sovereign power over the U.S. government. In a world where we see increasing ideological polarization, where people are retreating into their own information bubbles, where else might we be missing the deep, decades-old roots of a conflict because we're only looking at the fire at the end?
That is the question we should be asking. We look at the explosion, but we ignore the fuse that has been burning for generations.
Something to think about. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.